On the evening of July 30th, 2008, Greyhound bus 1170 was traveling from Alberta toward Ontario, Canada. The passengers aboard were expecting a routine trip, but instead were about to be witness to one of the most horrifying and gruesome murders that Canada has ever seen. The disturbing events would leave a man named Tim McLean dead and others mentally altered for the rest of their lives. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, the host, and thank you for joining today. Well, the series on Casey Anthony is out on Peacock, and if you're thinking about watching it, trust and believe you're going to get angry all over again. I'm not going to spoil it in case you're planning to watch it and haven't yet, but obviously she wasn't going to admit to having anything to do with the death of her child. She does admit to lying at nearly every turn in the investigation, which we kind of already knew. And she says the reason for that is not because she's hiding guilt, it's because that's how she was conditioned over the years. Her exact quote is, "I'm doing what I was conditioned to do." The police were trying to ask questions and get answers in order to help find her daughter, and she steadily fed them with nothing but lies. And that's her response now, in 2022. All this time to come up with an answer to the question, if you didn't kill your daughter or have anything to do with it, and genuinely don't know where she is or what happened, why do you lie to the police? I was doing what I was conditioned to do. Like I said, you're going to get angry. Before we get going with your story today that has nothing to do with Casey Anthony, thank God, this is your reminder to subscribe where you like to listen to podcasts and connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. Links are in the show notes of this episode as well as at 10minutemurder.com. Now to the story. Tim McLean was born on October 3rd, 1985, at Victoria General Hospital in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. He grew up in Winnipeg and had an enormous extended family, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. He was an active person who loved soccer, football, and motorbikes. Tim was described as a charmer and a free spirit who spent much of his time traveling and meeting new people. This zest for life and people could be what first drew Tim to the carny lifestyle. He would end up taking a job at the Red River Exhibition, a traveling carnival. Tim quickly realized how much he loved the carnival. The job afforded him the fast-paced and traveling lifestyle that he had always craved, while also being able to talk and meet new people during his time running rides on the Midway. By 2008, he was working as a carnival barker in Edmonton, Alberta. Tim had a happy life and could never have predicted that it would end in the most senseless and violent of ways at the hands of a complete stranger. Vince Lee was born on April 30th, 1968 in Dandong, China. He graduated from Wuhan Institute of Technology with a bachelor's degree in computing in 1992. He worked in Beijing as a computer software engineer from 1994 to 1998 before immigrating to Canada in 2001. Vince's first bout of trouble came a few years later when he was institutionalized sometime after gaining his citizenship. He was found by officers following the sun, something he claimed God told him to do. It's the first glimpse the general public would have of a man whose mental health was on the decline. After this incident, Vince seemingly went back to his normal life. He would go on to marry a woman named Anna and become a menial worker at Grant Memorial Church. While Vince never showed any signs of anger or other trouble, he would occasionally become frustrated by the language barrier between him and others. He quit his job after 6 months and picked up several other jobs, including service at Walmart, McDonald's, and newspaper delivery. In the weeks leading up to the killing, Vince was fired from Walmart after he had a disagreement with his coworkers. Despite this, he was described as normal, and except for the minor conflict at work, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But that would not last long. Vince was reportedly harboring disturbing thoughts about aliens and would later claim that God had chosen him to vanquish them. At the time, Vince didn't have access to proper mental health, and just 4 weeks after being fired, Vince would be arrested for murder. On July 20th, 2008, Tim McLean left Edmonton for Winnipeg on Greyhound bus number 1170. He was on his way home from work and sat in the last seat, one row in front of the bathroom. Vince Lee, on the other hand, had spent the night on a bench outside of a grocery store. He sold his laptop and other personal belongings while he waited for the bus. The bus eventually made a stop in Erickson, Manitoba at around 6 p.m., where Vince stepped on the bus as a passenger. Other passengers later said that they thought Vince seemed like an agitated person and a little confused as he climbed aboard, but that he never seemed like a threat. Vince sat at the front of the bus. The ride was quiet and peaceful. When the bus pulled up into a rest stop for a scheduled break, many of the passengers exited the bus to stretch, use the restrooms, or pick up snacks for the remainder of the trip. Vince was one of the people who got off the bus, but when everyone piled back on board, Vince took an empty seat next to Tim at the back. It was reported that Tim was friendly, and their exchange was very minimal. Tim put on his headphones, leaned his head against the window as he dozed off. Suddenly, screams of horror rang out throughout the Greyhound bus. Vince Lee had pulled out a large hunting knife and began to repeatedly stab Tim McLean in the neck and chest. Tim tried to fight back, but was overpowered by the violent attack, and he fell to the floor. The bus driver pleaded with Vince to stop as he pulled to the side of the road and opened the doors so that the panicked passengers could rush outside. Vince stayed on the bus where he continued his attack, eventually decapitating Tim and showing off the severed head of his victim to the horrified passengers looking on through the window. Vince began to sever and eat parts of Tim's body and flesh. When the Canadian police, or the RCMP, arrived on the scene, there was a standoff of 4 hours with the killer. When Vince tried to make a run for it, he was quickly detained and placed in handcuffs. The police would later find the victim's ear, nose, and tongue in Vince's pockets. Tim's eyes and a portion of his heart were never found, leading investigators to assume that Vince had eaten them. Vince Lee pled not guilty to charges of second-degree murder on account of a mental disorder. A psychiatrist said that Vince committed the attack believing that Tim McLean was an alien God told him to kill. Vince would be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and the judge ruled that he was not criminally responsible for the killing. Vince was sent to a mental health center but was released in 2016 after 6 years. Doctors believe that under the right medication, he poses no threat to the public and he currently lives free. Tragically, Tim wasn't the only victim. One of the officers who first responded to the scene, Ken Barker, would struggle with PTSD for years after witnessing the event. His mental health declined in the months after Vince Lee was released and eventually would lead to his suicide. Many passengers on the Greyhound bus number 1170 that night have reported struggles with PTSD and their mental health, with some experiencing nightmares, others falling to alcoholism to cope, and even being unfit to care for their children after the trauma. 5 months after Tim McLean was murdered, his son was born. Tim's son has become a light for Tim's family, who still struggle to make sense of his death. Vince Lee has since apologized for his actions and seems to recognize the magnitude of what he's done, but no apology can bring back the life he took in cold blood. Though his undiagnosed mental illness does give greater insight into why he committed such a heinous crime, it does nothing to justify it. Is it possible that Vince Lee has been able to manage his mental health illness enough that he no longer poses a threat? Or has his absolute discharge only given him the freedom to repeat his actions?